So welcome to the Herland Report, Mr. Joaquin Flores. You are a journalist and editor and a graduate in political science from California State University in LA. You live in Belgrade and in Eastern Europe and have run quite an extensive and acclaimed journalist's point of view out of that city and Serbia. And we're discussing today the Middle East and the Syria war. And of course, it's almost impossible to discuss the Syria war without looking at the Libya war, the Arab Spring, and all the events that came out of that situation. But
yes.
How come the Syria war has become so polarized?
It's because truth is the first casualty of war. And so the narratives become polarized. I'm not saying the truth is somewhere in the middle, because then that just simply creates the incentive for both sides to exaggerate further, to push the middle over to their side. But we've seen that, and that's polarization. So to the extent that we've seen in the Western narrative that Assad is gassing his own people, murdering his own people, these are fictions. Was there repression? Were there imprisonments? Was there torture? Are there political prisoners? Yes, like in the United States, there is too. But when the accusations became ridiculous and unsustainable by facts against the Syrian government, then pro-Syrian forces, their international allies, the Syrian government, they began to project an alternate reality in the other direction, that there were not any major problems, that Assad had full support, that all the things that were being said about the government were lies. And they weren't. I mean, there were some real problems. And for example, the white helmets coming into the picture. This, for many people, seems like a recent advent. But it, in fact, has been growing slowly since the early 1970s. So there was in 1972 or 73, correct me and forgive me if I'm wrong, the Hafez al-Assad began to move away from more of the Soviet model of direct state planning in all spheres of the economy, and kind of learned a little bit more from Khrushchev and a little bit more from the West to liberalize the economy, to start taking on IMF debt. But also, the British MI5 had been supporting and building up Islamists for a long time, since the 40s and 50s, really since the end of the Ottoman Empire, Lawrence of Arabia, the development of the Muslim Brotherhood. And so the Muslim Brotherhood in Syria, as early as the 70s, there was attempts by Hafez al-Assad to incorporate elements of them, to sort of buy them in, buy them off, to place an imam who is ostensibly a Sunni, even a radical Sunni cleric, even one who previously said anti-pan-Arab nationalist things, and get him to be kind of neutral and bestow his blessings on the government. And in turn, the government of Hafez al-Assad would then bestow some legitimacy upon the Muslim Brotherhood, because they were, of course, under the rules of the IMF, had to introduce these human rights organizations. And the Muslim Brotherhood in the 20th century, in particular since the 1950s, influenced by the Egyptian scholar Qutb, really evolved and developed the concept of introducing radical Islamism with social programs. So this put them in competition with the secular communist and socialist left, or the pan-Arab nationalists, who had kind of somewhat of a bandwidth with the pro-Soviet sphere. And how to incorporate this, the Muslim Brotherhood began to take up also kind of the language of the left, a little bit, in their own kind of social program way. So then they built up parallel institutions within society. So the IMF would say, for example, you have to put austerity, you have to put budget cuts on education. So then Assad's father had to, line item veto bills about education and healthcare and reduce the budget. Who filled the gap were these civil society organizations being financed by Gulf monarchs and the United States in a long game to create what are called dual power institutions. Vladimir Lenin, actually, the Bolshevik leader, was one of the first to write about the necessity in trying to overthrow a government ultimately, that you have to create dual power organs within the society. So you have to start to take away the credibility of the government while the government still stands by performing certain critical necessary government functions, but through the philanthropic sphere. So the White Helmets really evolved out of these civil society organizations that the West and Gulf state monarchs had been financing going back to the 70s. And then, of course, when Wolfowitz and Pearl and the neocons and Bush II was president, and they made the war on Iraq and Afghanistan, then they put the ultimatum to Gaddafi, they put the ultimatum to Assad, now Bashar al-Assad, that you must let some of the even crazier radical Salafis out of jail. Let them integrate into these NGOs that were already Muslim Brotherhood backed or Muslim Brotherhood led NGOs that had been, for a certain period and in a certain limited way, kind of moderated or co-opted a bit by the state, but were festering slowly, building these dual functions in society. So then what we saw erupt finally, 7 years ago, is the culmination of a process going back to decades and decades ago.
And this is very interesting, of course, especially thinking about Europe and the United States today, as we see parallel societies developing very much here too, and much of Paris being owned by the Arab princes, and,
yes,
and the whole suburbia really in Paris and many places in Europe, being owned, foreign owned, and it's much of the same Muslim Brotherhood infiltrating European cities, and,
yes,
and radicalism growing very strongly. But
yes,
I so liked you mentioning the Pan-Arabic area because many people in the West do not know really much about the history of the Middle East, and they don't know how Pan-Arabism grew out of, let's say, colonialism, and colonialism again being imposed on the Middle East as a consequence of the post-Ottoman period.
right,
And you had the urbanization, of course, at the same time all over the world and in Europe as well, and so many young Arabs moving into the cities also
right,
in the Middle East. And the Pan-Arabic movement coming out as a nationalist movement,
right,
and as a secular, we would say secular.
yes, yes,
Of course, the Muslims in the Middle East would say a Muslim, an Islamic movement, but we would call it secular,
right,
in the sense that no women wore the veil.
right,
Women had equal education as men.
yes,
We see it in Iran, of course, under the Shah. We see it also in Syria under Bashar al-Assad, and
yes,
also his father, who was a Pan-Arabist.
yes,
We saw it with Nasser. We saw it with
yes,
Muammar Gaddafi.
yes,
And in Libya, for example, too, you had women were in the army, free
right,
education for women, a strong secular kind of movement. And one of the things that characterized the Pan-Arabic movement, which originated out of Syria actually, and actually one of its founding fathers or founding philosophers was a Christian Syrian.
right,
And then this was also the view of Saddam Hussein to a large
right,
extent,
right, also Baptist,
was the respect for the plurality,
right,
which again was something that we also found much more, I would say, during the Ottoman Empire.
right,
One could argue not
yes,
that much, of course, but
it
at
had
least
periods,
more.
yes,
At least more than what we see under Islamist rule, or for example the Salafis and the Muslim
yes,
Brotherhood countries of today. So the paradox being,
yes, big one,
once the West decides to go into the Middle East, they remove precisely the secular leaders,
Right.
the secular Islamic
Right.
leaders, and those who were the protectors of the minorities
Right.
in those different countries, and those that really wanted kind of like a secular Islamic rule.
Right.
And they end up putting in power
Yes.
the Al-Qaeda groups and the
Right.
Salafis and the Muslim Brotherhood, and thus was the end of the Arab Spring.
And that is the process of balkanization. And they balkanize, they were able to take it apart. Now we've seen the tide turn, and I think that this tide is turning in another direction now. I view the critical year as 2013, and I think that the sort of NATO Atlanticist, modern Western hegemonic concept of globalization really began to see, we could really see concretely that it was not going to win after 2013, when there was a fake chemical weapons attack. It was exposed by the clergy, by the citizens. Even Western journalists had to admit that something didn't happen, that they had said, they had to backtrack, their own words. Yeah. And what happened? Well, in England, they weren't able to get the approval from Parliament to attack Syria. That was the end of it. And then there was threats. I guess David Cameron was prime minister at the time, and they were threatening him, oh, well, if you don't go forward with this, we're going to expose your youthful occult-like activities, all these sort of bizarre rituals that some elements of the elites kind of have to get what they call in Russia kompromat, compromising material, so that they can use it against them later should they get out of line. And Cameron doesn't follow orders, or he isn't able to mobilize the support in England to bomb Syria. And suddenly we see this bizarre, I don't know if it's true or not, but something with a pig, something with, I mean, it was very bizarre. You know, listeners and readers will understand what I'm talking about, for sure. And when we look at how Pan-Arabism as a project, some things you touched on are very interesting, because there's so many contradictions, and it's like an onion. You can peel back layer after layer. Within the Ottoman period, there were periods that were more autocratic, periods that were more liberal or progressive. There were different rulers. It was 500-year, 800-year empire. So, I mean, of course, there was different phases. It wasn't this one way to look at it, you know. And so then the English in particular and the French, in their development of colonial rule in the Middle East, they began to pick winners and to create ethnic tensions that, now the Ottomans had played upon to a certain extent, but they couldn't have failed states. And I think that that's the critical difference. The left in the West, the first world radical left, in the 20th century, the United States would stage coups just to replace the government, and then to have a government that gave them more access to the resources, natural resources, cheap labor, et cetera, austerity, et cetera. But we live in a different time. They're really now trying to create failed states. And so the left has completely missed the boat. They've completely lost the script. They're like unable to articulate how it is that they're trying to create failed states now. The goal in Ukraine wasn't to put Poroshenko. Poroshenko is the compromise candidate that both EU and Russia and the United States had to agree on. But what the United States really wanted to see was these Pravi sector, Azov battalion and Pravi sector type militias increase the ethnic cleansing, increase the insanity, increase the destabilization, to create like a vortex, a black hole of destabilization that would force Russia to come in militarily in full force and openly, instead of through the Voentorg process, which is like the American process, private military contractors, the Russian version of George Soros, right, who is Konstantin Malofeyev, and how they sort of, the Russians mirrored the American method of putting that firewall in between government and private actors, so that now legally, and it's true, officially, the Russian government is not supporting the rebels in the Donbass. The Russian government is not financing them. The Russian government does not send them weapons. It's decentralized through private party actors who happen to be Russian, who are acting as philanthropists because they have some sympathy, ostensibly, the story goes, with the ethnic Russians in the east of the country. But the goal was to create a failed state in Ukraine. They don't want to replace Assad with some other version of Assad that's pro-American. They want to create a failed state and break it up, and then just have the oil fields and the resources, the river, the waterways, and the oil fields be heavily militarized microstates, but for everyone else, or like the urban centers, Aleppo, Homs, Damascus, that can be blown up. That's just local wealth. That's local capital. That's what was building a local society. They can get the resources, but they don't need to control the whole government. They would rather create a Mad Max scenario. They want to see a post-apocalyptic scenario that creates broader and broader concentric circles of destabilization so that more and more of the surrounding stable governments are drawn into the instability. Then the weapons manufacturers come in, the speculation about oil, water, very big for some countries there who want to have the oil from Iraq, water from Syria, and so forth. So this is the world that we're living in. And I think that crossing that bridge and getting past that conceptual wall, that imperialism today is not about taking over a country and putting in a puppet. Because ultimately they learned. We can take the example of Afghanistan, Ahmad Karzai. He was like a CEO of a big American oil firm. I mean, he spent more time in England and the United States than he did in Afghanistan. He was only nominally Afghani. He was wearing a suit, Brooks Brothers, Hugo Boss, etc. Suddenly he shows up like in robes and stuff like he's an Afghan leader. It was a total joke at first. But then, because the gravity of local politics, because politics is ultimately local, in order to create a stable Kabul government meant that you had to have agreement from this Taliban group, the Northern Alliance, this other group, Pashtuns, Sarbani, the different, you have to get them to work together. You need to have consent. You have to build a functioning society. So then Karzai went off script, you see. So we saw this happen in Pakistan. And so I think the Syria example is so fascinating, and I think is even a cause for hope, because we saw since 2013 that this globalization movement that used the resources of the United States, some may not even say that it's an American project, but a globalist one, an international bourgeoisie, the international nomads. That's why the Parisian billionaires don't really care that Arab millionaires and billionaires are buying up Paris, because they in turn can buy up parts of Dubai. So for them, and they can intermarry, and they can party together, they have the same taste in wine, in clothes, in women, in song. That's the globalization. They're the ones, right, living the 1960s dream of let's hold hands and I want to teach the world to sing. I mean, they crossed that bridge. They left everyone else behind. Now they have to create failed states.
It's been such a paradox, too, to follow the line of ISIS, which was, of course, a terror organization that all of a sudden came out of nowhere in 2014 with blistering pictures all over the Western media, beautiful new trucks, and kind of like the same kind of groups that we saw in Libya, also with beautiful, great trucks. And that was just such a paradox, because we know that the U.S. had tried to take Assad from the south, and all of a sudden there's this army coming from the north.
Right.
And then with all the threats all over Europe, and they're coming to bomb a place near you, and all of that, and we've seen how the ISIS has evaporated out of Raqqa now. And paradoxically, then, of course, the Kurdish taking over the exact same areas that we saw the ISIS had. And the Americans, then again, all of a sudden now in Syria, in control over precisely the same areas that hold the oil and the wealth of the Syrian people. So it's really a power play in that region, isn't it?
It's very interesting. I spoke with a journalist who had returned from Syria, and the gentleman was telling me that it is questionable to what extent the Kurds and ISIS were really in live fire battles with each other. Instead, it looked like organized retreats and then organized occupations. So it was the United States on both ends, along with Gulf state monarchs and a few other countries in the Levant, and ISIS would come in, and then the Kurds suddenly would beat them back. Now, the Kurds had less training, less armaments, less support than the Syrian army, yet they were able to push back ISIS with minimal losses. So it really looked more like change of the guard, not that these two sides were really fighting each other. Now, I don't doubt that there were some real battles. However, the overall picture looks more like a change of the guard and not two sides that were fighting. And so it's very interesting to me to see how when they developed this plan to divide Syria up and to create a failed state, that the imagery and the cinematography and the advertising for ISIS, the technical side alone is an interesting subject.
Very much so.
Clearly, only the technology is held by the Qataris and was done through Al Jazeera. Al Jazeera produced the ISIS propaganda. Let's just put that out in the open. That's who did it. But the messaging and what they were saying, the message of when they would have one of these soldiers speaking about why they joined, they began to produce a very left-wing approach that was both anarchist and anti-racism. So you would have a jihadi from Africa who's black, a jihadi from the south of Russia or the Caucasus who's Dagestani or etc. And so you see a white guy, a black guy, a Chinese Uyghur, right? It's almost like the internationalists of the old communists, right? And there they all are together, and they're saying, we're against states, because of course Salafists are against governments and states. This makes them different. These Wahhabists, this makes them different, of course, from the Muslim Brotherhood, but this idea of they call it an Islamic state, but what they're really talking about is a stateless state. So you have an ummah, not a caliphate, with a caliph who's like a ruler. And because a ruler then is venerated and worshipped as a man, which is apostasy in their variant of Islam. So they took many of these things. They were consulted by British intelligence assets who've been studying Islam and anarchism, like the pedophile Hakim Bey. He's an anarchist. And they were able to fuse this messaging and put it through students and intellectuals in the West to write the script using the cinematographers and the expertise from Al Jazeera, who are also Western educated, and create a message that made it seem like this is Che Guevara.
It really is completely amazing. And it's amazing too when you hear the stories from within the Middle East. I've worked for many years on these topics and have connections in a number of these countries. Because when you speak to Egyptians, for example, they clearly say that these ISIS fighters don't speak proper Arabic. When you go to Libya, of course, there were the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group and the groups, the Al-Qaeda groups from back in the day in Libya as well, but these are foreign fighters.
In Syria,
and the same in Syria as well.
Yes.
So it's remarkable how many European youngsters, Muslim youngsters, that have been drawn into this so-called extremist web. And it's also remarkable how many imams that suddenly came out of nowhere,
Yes.
that traveled all the way to Europe
Right.
to recruit these, one may say, mercenaries. Because, of course, we know what's been happening in the United States at the privatization of the American army and the entry of Blackwater and Eric Prince. And, you know, this is a big problem now. We see it in Africa, how they go to Africa and,
Yes.
and take the child soldiers that end up in the Yemeni war and everything. So it's like a mercenary
Right.
kind of playground Syria has become, and a geopolitical struggle of dimensions.
It is. There's a class system inside of ISIS, and who you are seeing fighting, some are mercenaries, others are just desperate. Keep in mind that the 2008 global market crash, which was then parlayed into the quantitative easing, which was then used to corner the market on perishable goods of those companies that marketed grains to the Middle East, that a whole generation now, people who were 10 years old in 2008 are 18 years old today. And those economies never recovered. And now they're being offered not only to do something that's righteous, let's say to fight for political Islam, but they're also being offered salaries like $100, $150, $200 a month, which is not bad money if you think that it's also something that you believe in, and it's also much better money than no money. And then you have a lot of perks that come with war. There's rape, pillage, they have access to drugs. They are in a two-class system, however. So when you look at how does ISIS have the manpower, now of course you can have guerrilla fighters running around with machine guns in the street, but who are the coordinators? They have war rooms with maps and computers, they have internet websites, so you have a whole class of Europeans. But this really speaks to a European problem. This is not an Islamic problem. This is because Europe has failed to create a vision of what Europe can be and should be. You can't just say that the point of our society is that everyone does what they want. That doesn't build community. So you have second and third generation young men born in Germany, born in France, born in England. Their parents immigrated. Now they are in the society of Nike and McDonald's and Lady Gaga, and none of that has any meaning or substance to them, like it doesn't for many people. And they are now in this post-colonial conflict where they are deracinated. They are removed from their roots. So now they are trying to find their roots and get in touch with their identity to be a true and authentic person. So the ISIS technocrats who are behind the computers, who are operating the drones, who are doing some of the planning, they have college degrees from Paris, from Berlin, from London. They were born in Europe. They're not migrants themselves, by and large, many of them. Or they've lived there for most of their lives. And what they are fighting against is the decay of modernity. And radical Islam is just a placeholder for the type of meaningful society that everyone yearns for. And so until the West understands that you need to have a mission, that societies have to be mission-based, of course you must have plurality and discourse and disagreements and the right to protest, and you should have free and fair elections. These things are very important, but the society itself must have a mission. What it means to be French or what it means to be European, this is not a thing that exists. I mean, you have in Germany the anti-German party. You have generally in the West that it is a sign that you are educated if you are against modernity in the way that they believe they have a view of a 1930s conception of modernity, and they don't understand that their hippie rebellion has become the dominant paradigm of the West. and it has no meaning except what's the individual self-fulfillment. And so divorce rates have skyrocketed, youth alienation has skyrocketed, drug use has skyrocketed. These are not directly poverty related, because in the past there was much more poverty. This is about not having mission and purpose in life, and commercialism, crony capitalism, materialism in society. It can't give people that meaning. And so if you happen to be a person of Arab descent by 1 or 2 or 3 generations, then you're going to start seeing these imams who were imported from Gulf monarchies and opened up new mosques, and they're just actually trying to get back in touch with what's real. And then they end up in a conflict that's not even theirs, because they're really more French than they are Syrian. So it's really a paradox.
It's fascinating to hear you say that, and it kind of corroborates with the American story as we see it today, because who is so much against, for example, President Donald Trump? A man who's, you know, the result of maybe that's how the American voters voted in order to try to get away from some of the elitism that has been annoying them. And when you look at the Midwest, for example, and no manufacturing, you know, in the Detroit area, jobs in the United States, and you see the immense tax havens in which all these great, you know, great firms, tech firms, and Facebook, Google, George Soros, and all have their money, and they don't, all that tax money doesn't come into the United States, and Trump asking for changes pertaining to that in an attempt to grow the national growth. Right. You know, and give people, get the jobs back in the United States. One would assume that everybody were very happy about that. Right. That you see the media, we know, of course, over 90% of the American media is owned by only 6 corporations now, and back in the 80s that used to be like 50, 60 corporations. Right. So it's very, and the same group that own the American mainstream media also own the weapons manufacturing and the globalist elite, so to speak. So when you look at that perspective, also spilling into Syria, it's just really interesting how one may say that there is an elitist group that doesn't exactly think about the people. Right. And that's what the good old socialists and also the conservatives and many different groups try to build up national sovereignty and the respect for a nation. And the aim was to create a society or a nation where the people who lived within that nation could have good lives. We're kind of quite far away from that right now.
It's very interesting that you say that, and I happen to agree. And it's, I think, one of the great successes of the ruling elite in the United States or the Atlanticist West is that they've been so successful in dividing the people in these categories. And many of the people share similar values, but because politics is local movements have made this movement sound libertarian, and this other movement is socialist. And on paper, you would think that libertarians and socialists have like nothing in common. But when you really look at their view about what it means to be a human being, what does freedom mean, what does it mean to live, to work, what is fairness, what is justice, they have many very similar views, but they're speaking a different language. It's like speaking, you know, Greek and Arabic. And so they can't, and so they're talking past each other.
Well, is this one of the reasons why it has been so easy for the mainstream media to show only one side of the story in the Syrian conflict instead of depicting the complexity of the issues?
Well, there's a problem with storytelling, and there's a problem with the media. And I think that that's why there are just less and less people watching television, because you have, of course, the sound bites, the segments, the way that they're timed, the pacing of it. There's almost, not to sound conspiratorial, but there's almost been a one-to-one parity between people's increasing inability to pay attention and decreasing attention spans and the increase of this diagnosis called ADD or ADHD, and that news and information comes in these very superficial single-serve formats that gives a very small black and white image that's supposed to just get you to think one way and then move along and do the next thing. And I think that that was what is happening now, and in connection with why the Western model not the old Western model, but the neoliberal model, is disintegrating, they had too much confidence in their ability to control people. It was almost like their own legitimacy to rule was based in a belief that they're the elites because they're smarter than everyone else. So they tried to create a media and cultural system that reflected the stupidity that they imagined people to have. But in reality, people are a bit smarter than that. And I think that's what we're really seeing, is that people are able to dig in deeper. They want to get to the heart of a question. So when we look at the political repression or the media censorship in the United States, it's like we're living in an upside-down world that a real estate multimillionaire, maybe sociopath, you know, right, is saying we have a problem of media censorship in the United States, that it had to be this character. You know, people had thought for a long time that it would be like a Huey Long or a labor leader or a populist from the South, and it ends up being a New York City real estate developer who kind of taps into the gestalt, who understands, we're talking a man who's what, 70, 72 years old, who has the knowledge of social media and human dynamics that a 25-year-old Silicon Valley, you know, techie would have. I mean, he really understands how Twitter, Instagram, YouTube works. I mean, this is an amazing feat. And there's this whole diatribe that he's an idiot. I mean, he's clearly beyond competent. And one can inherit 46 million or 146 million or whatever. And what 99% of those people do is they buy property in the French Riviera and they spend their life snorting coke with prostitutes and blah, 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 and voila. And he is just someone who has such high energy and has decided to do more and more and more. Now, in the very questionable field of clinical psychology, they call that a narcissist or a sociopath. But it actually is just the model of highly successful people. And what's very interesting about the Donald Trump phenomenon is that he was able to speak to whole layers of society that the left had abandoned, because the left moved away from the socioeconomic issues that made the left the popular labor movement that it used to be, and turned it into a virtue signaling, status signaling, elitist ideology of urban, college-educated intellectuals and the new bureaucracy. And so this is the bridge, this is the gulf that Trump was able to traverse, and to be able to connect to all these people. And the war that we're seeing in the United States between the elites, he couldn't do it if there weren't at least some segments of the military and the elites that could see that, let's say, the prior ruling junta, which is still fighting for control of the deep state, and they still control the intelligence organizations to a large extent. But to see that they were just focused and dead set on this concept that, well, the Soviet Union collapsed, so therefore we rule the world. And how can it be any other way? And they just couldn't conceptually wrap their heads around the fact that in Latin America, or through the BRICS countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, that other nodes of capital in different parts of the world, despite and in the face of transatlantic capital accumulation to London, City of London, or New York, or Berlin, that despite that, other parts of the world developed, and they built national sovereignty movements, whether they were of the left, whether they were religious, whether they were conservative. Those were just superstructural colors, you know, but the real substance was capital accumulation happening at the local level. And when capital is local, it benefits people more locally, because then you get things possible like micro banking or small investment, entrepreneurship, education, and it works against the outflow of migrants, because people want to stay where there's opportunities. People don't just want to leave their families for no reason. People like where they live generally, you know? So it's a fascinating process, and that the war that we're seeing in the United States and what's happening with Trump now can only be understood in those terms. You can't even follow the left, what they say about Trump. Now, equally as nauseating at times are the Trump supporters. But that's, again, not the essence of what's happening. There's really a war of the elites. And that's a sign that American hegemony is on the decline when they start fighting each other, right? Because victory has 1,000 fathers, but defeat is a bastard. And they are arguing over whose fault it is. But the fault is that the American empire is in free fall. It is in collapse. And all of this craziness we're seeing with the attempt to create failed states and deploy otpor and deploy the color revolutions and the cult of political correctness and the authoritarianism calling itself liberalism in the United States is not a sign of power. It's a sign of dissent.
And on that note, I would like to thank you so much, Mr. Joaquin Flores, for discussing the matters of the Middle East, geopolitics, Syria, ISIS, and the foreign fighters and mercenaries, and the human side to all of this. Thank you very much for joining us here at the Herland Report.
Thank you for having me.